Vacancy Legal Recruitment, a refreshingly unique and personal talent agency developed specifically for legal. Dedicated to the sector and with extensive experience working across legal services and legal technology, we bridge the gap between your requirements and top-tier legal talent. Get in touch today and say hello at vacancy.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today we've got a bit of a history lesson, I think. Shoba Aziz, a barrister at Great James Street Chambers, is going to talk to us about Narcissus, who is the historical figure for what is now known as narcissistic behaviour. And you're going to talk to us about gaslighting as well, Shoba, what it is, how they manifest, what the view of the courts is at the moment around these subjects, because they're not particularly well known and understood. So hopefully you're going to shed some light on them as well. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much for inviting me. As you've just mentioned, I'm a barrister from Great James Street Chambers, and I have over 20 years of experience in this legal field. I have a multidisciplinary practice, and my true passion lies in private, child and family law, particularly in cases involving domestic abuse and coercive control. I specialize in representing clients caught up in complex child arrangement disputes, high conflict cases and situations where psychological manipulation plays a significant role. And my work isn't just about advocacy in the court. It's about standing beside the clients, many who've been enduring prolonged emotional and psychological abuse, ensuring that they're supported, heard, empowered through the legal process. A large part of my career has been dedicated over the years to legal aid, which has allowed me to represent vulnerable individuals who might otherwise struggle for access to justice. Giving back to the community has always been to the heart of what I do. Beyond the courtroom, I'm deeply committed to raising awareness about domestic abuse and narcissistic behaviours, and I regularly speak at conferences and provide training on how the issues intersect with law, equipping professionals with the tools to better support victims and clients. So I'm looking forward to talking about narcissistic behaviour and gaslighting today.
Well, I can absolutely vouch for you speaking at conferences and your expertise. You spoke at the Today's Family Lawyer conference in September of last year. Let's dive right into the topic at hand then, because as I said in the introduction, I think we've got a much better understanding of what domestic abuse is and the impact that it has on people. But can you explain specifically what gaslighting is and what narcissistic behaviours are?
Of course. I think conversations around narcissism and gaslighting are more important now than ever, especially because these terms have entered into everyday language and into the legal language as well, because there was a particular case law which has now come to the forefront, which I will discuss later. And it's very important to understand the psychological depth and the real world impact that people are going through. And it's very much underestimated. Gaslighting and narcissism go hand in hand, particularly in abusive and controlling relationships, which would be domestic abuse. We all know what domestic abuse is. It doesn't just mean physical violence, it's emotional violence, it's psychological violence, which everyone goes through. It's a manipulation as well. Gaslighting is a psychological manipulation tactic which is designed to make someone question their own reality, memories, and perceptions. It's a subtle yet devastating form of emotional abuse that can leave the victims feeling confused and disorientated and doubting their own sanity. Now, narcissist and narcissism comes from, there's actually a narcissism personality disorder, and it's a mental health condition where people have unreasonable high sense of their own importance. They need to, and they seek too much attention and want people to admire them. People with this disorder lack the ability to understand or care about the feelings of others. The narcissistic personality disorder affects more males than females, believe it or not, and it begins in the teens or the early adulthood. And because the cause of narcissistic personality disorder is unknown, there is no way to prevent the condition. Now, narcissistic behavior, on the other hand, is a pattern of self-centered manipulation and exploitive actions. The narcissists lack empathy, refuse to take accountability, and use coercive tactics such as intimidation, emotional abuse, and maintain control over their victims. They have intense focus on themselves and a deep need for admiration. Now, examples of gaslighting and narcissistic behavior can be the following: isolating a person from their friends or family, depriving them of basic needs such as food, sleep, or financial independence, controlling their daily life, dictating where they can go, who they can see, what they can wear, and acting in the best interests of them, but they're not acting in the best interests of them, creating a cycle of dependency and belittling them, making them feel worthless, incapable of doing anything, humiliating, degrading, and dehumanizing everything that they do. The behaviors are designed to strip the victim of the confidence and autonomy, making it harder for them to break free. So understanding the patterns is crucial to recognizing this abuse.
One of the challenging things around this subject is being able to spot when your client is being impacted by gaslighting, domestic abuse, narcissism. How do these issues manifest themselves in relationships, and how can practitioners identify them in the course of the relationship that they're building with their clients?
So this is a very interesting question, and it's very, very important for practitioners and also victims to understand how these behaviors would manifest. Because many victims of narcissistic abuse and gaslighting have endured years of emotional and psychological control without even realizing it. That's the most unsettling part. A lot of them are very emotionally drained, but they believe the treatment is normal or it's even their fault until someone helps them see the truth. Domestic abuse isn't just about physical. It includes controlling coercive behavior, financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and all of this is deeply damaging. Victims often come to realize the extent of the abuse only when they begin a legal process. And this was especially prevalent in the COVID pandemic, where people endured the behaviors and started staying with their partners for the sake of the children. And that's a very, very, very sad thing. Narcissism isn't just about someone with an inflated ego. It's a persuasive personality pattern rooted in control, entitlement, and a lack of empathy. And when it's paired with gaslighting, which is the form of the psychological manipulation, it's designed to make someone question their own reality. The effects can be damaging, and victims find themselves trapped in a cycle of confusion, self-doubt, emotional dependency, unable to trust anyone, even their own instinct. Now, specifically in my area of work, in the legal family courts, I see firsthand how the dynamics not only play out interpersonally, but how they influence the legal part of the court and through the whole actual preparation of the case, which is one of the main points. And whether it's through coercive control, distorted facts, or attempts to discredit the victim's credibility, it's important to shed the light on the subtle and the tactics used by the narcissistic individual to help people recognize the red flags early and offer strategies for both personal resilience and where legal protection can be put forward. Now, a few ways that it can be manifested, and the way gaslighting and narcissism can be manifested are the following. Parental alienation, when one parent systematically manipulates a child to turn against the parent, often making false accusations of abuse or neglect to sever their bond. Fabricated allegations, where the narcissistic individual may create exaggerated or entirely false claims, positioning themselves as a victim while portraying the other parent as the abuser. Legal harassment and financial control, where the abusers may use excessive court applications, deliberate delays, and refusals to comply with legal orders or financial orders to exhaust the victim, making it harder for them to fight back. The narcissists appear charming, use contradictory behavior, cooperate in front of professionals while being manipulative and abusive behind closed doors. This two-faced behavior makes it difficult for victims to prove their experience. And importantly, victims and perpetrators come from all walks of life. Abuse is not limited to any specific background, status, or community. Recognizing these patterns are the first step to breaking free into seeking any kind of justice. And gaslighting is one of the narcissistic's most effective tools because it attacks the victim's perception. And that's exactly what they want. I've worked with clients over time who were made to feel that they were the problem. For instance, one client kept records of abusive text messages. And every time she confronted her partner, he told her that she was overreacting. Eventually, she stopped trusting her own instincts. And that's the effect of what gaslighting is when it's eroding the self-trust in someone. So I think that's how you can say that gaslighting and narcissistic behavior do manifest.
I always think about sort of the role of the practitioner in all of this, because as you say, that the narcissist often presents as charming and even presents as a victim themselves, don't they? What are there telltale signs that practitioners can see, can drill into? I mean, it takes an enormous amount of bravery for victims to even, get to the point at which they think they need legal support, doesn't it?
Yes, of course it does. I mean, it takes a lot of confidence to actually go ahead and say, yes, I think we do need legal support. I mean, the practitioners themselves, they need to be educated on this. It's very, very important that they are educated. They need to understand what the signs are, because the victims are vulnerable and fearful. And the role of the practitioner is to support without judgment, to ensure that the victims are feeling safe while also advocating for their legal rights. Training is essential to identify narcissism, coercive control, and gaslighting. It's important to educate the professionals as well as the clients, because victims don't actually realize they're being manipulated, and awareness will empower them. They need to be offered choices as well. They need to understand the options and that they're not trapped in any kind of relationship. And the professionals need to be trained on this. And it's very, very important for them to understand, which is why I always try to ensure when I speak to my client that they have the most safest and secure environment to be able to speak to me. Now, a lot of my clients are women. And a lot of the women go through this because a lot of the perpetrators are men. But it's not to say that it's not the other way around, which is why I say victim and perpetrator. Because it could be a man, it could be a woman. And it's very important to show empathy to them, because every survivor's story is valid. Judgment has no place. And the professionals need to understand, and this is only going to be understood if awareness has been created. More professionals need training to handle the cases effectively, and there needs to be the support available. There are organizations that the professionals can also inform the victims of. And there's a lot of women's organizations out there who've been victims of domestic abuse and the support organizations. I mean, there's one called Waits in the Midlands who helps women fleeing abuse find housing and rebuild their lives. In London, there's an organization called Southall Black Sisters. They offer free legal advice and support to women escaping domestic violence. I mean, there is a major gap in professional training on narcissistic abuse and coercive control, and more awareness and education will ensure that the victims receive the best possible protection and justice. I think that's how professionals can help.
Well, obviously things like the podcast that we're doing today will help. Hopefully, people are going to listen and understand it a little bit more. There's got to be a more joined up approach to it as well, not just from the legal sector, but also, as you say, in terms of some of those refuges and some of the some information that might be out there for people. And I mean, just to reiterate the point that you made earlier, this really does affect absolutely anybody and everybody. You've got an upcoming conference at which you're speaking where there's quite a high profile person speaking.
Yes, that is true. I am speaking in June the 14th in the Narcissistic Abuse Conference, which is going to be an amazing conference with a great lineup. And there is a very high profile person speaking about his experiences. And this is what I was trying to explain, that narcissistic behavior and gaslighting can happen to anyone. It doesn't have to be a spouse. It can be a parent. It can be anybody. It can just be someone in a relationship, but it manifests especially when you're living with the person. It makes it more aware when you're actually living with the person. And as I said, COVID was very prevalent, and a lot of clients I've had have actually said during COVID it became worse because obviously we were all in one house or one room. Some people just lived in one room, and it's very, very difficult how they can actually try and get away from their perpetrator. I mean, it happens in everyday life, and it can happen to absolutely anyone. It doesn't mean that you are rich or poor. It can be anybody. And that's where my line of work comes in, where I can see this on a day-to-day basis, and I have to offer empathy to all the clients in the best way possible. There was one particular case where it was a final hearing and I hadn't done the previous fact find, but the woman was so distraught. She was so scared. We got to court. They didn't even have a separate room for her. The court said, sorry, solicitor didn't actually say that you needed a separate room. And I said, yes, but we had asked for special measures. And she was so happy when she got that room. And she said, I thank you so much. Something simple like this, giving that care to the client, they're just so vulnerable. I think that's why I feel more for them when they say and they tell me their story. And after that, she just opened up and told me everything. And we went to the hearing, and she was like, oh, I don't want him to have this. I don't want him to have that. I then put that all across to the judge, and we got an order which she was happy with. And that's the main thing for the victim in this case, and especially in the family courts where narcissistic behavior and gaslighting is more prevalent nowadays.
Well, that really leads on to the next point I wanted to kind of discuss, which is that, the law famously doesn't keep up with society. It's only in the 80s and 90s that forcibly having sex with your wife ultimately was identified as rape. What is the attitude of the courts to domestic abuse, to gaslighting, and to narcissistic behaviour? And do they understand them, to your point about needing wider education on the topic?
Yes, gaslighting is not a standalone criminal offence. It's legally recognised as a form of a coercive control under Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act, which criminalises controlling coercive behaviour in intimate or familiar relationships. Additionally, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 broadened the legal definition of domestic abuse to include emotional and psychological harm, explicitly capturing the gaslighting behaviour. Now, the legal protections for victims at present of gaslighting and narcissistic abuse that they can seek through the courts would be a non-molestation order, preventing the abuser from harassing, intimidating, or threatening the victim, an occupation order, which is restricting the abuser's rights to reside in or enter the family home, and a restraining order, which would be following a criminal proceeding to prevent the ongoing harm. The legal framework to ensure that the child's welfare remains top priority would be the family procedure rules, which would practice Direction 12J, which also governs how the court handle child arrangements order where the domestic abuse is alleged, ensuring that the child's safety is paramount. And then the Children's Act gives courts the power to restrict contact or impose supervised visitation while the parent's behaviour poses a risk to the child's welfare. There have been a lot of challenges in the legal proceedings, and the law surrounding narcissism and gaslighting is still evolving. And the psychological abuse can be difficult to prove with traditional evidence. The court emphasizes fairness in proceedings while prioritizing the safety and well-being of children involved. And as the awareness grows, legal systems are increasingly recognizing and addressing the profound impact of emotional and psychological abuse. What the court's attitude would be to the issues and what you were saying in terms of the evidence that they're looking for. Well, the domestic abuse doesn't end with separation. They weaponize their parental role to control the victim, making them feel inferior and powerless. And this is a common trend in family proceedings. Victim, often unaware of narcissistic behavior and gaslighting, may blame themselves or concede to avoid conflict. And that's the very sad thing, because a lot of the victims feel when they come to court, we don't want to go through this anymore. We don't want the children to go through this anymore. And, now we're out of it. It's not going to be a problem. But they're going to use the child as a weapon. And sometimes they even try and get them to do 50-50 when they've never taken the children to school, they've never taken the children to swimming, never taken the children to basketball, but then they turn around and say, we can do 50-50, and they try and be the better parent, but they're not the better parent. It can be physically draining for the victim, and the perpetrator will ignore court orders to maintain control. Now, the courts are becoming more aware of psychological abuse, proving it remains a challenge. Messages, emails, recording, showing manipulation, witness statements from professionals, teachers or friends, if it's to do with the children, expert psychological reports, diagnosing any kind of coercive control, patterns of litigation abuse, such as repeated unfounded application. And gaslighting and narcissistic abuse are harder to prove than physical violence, making awareness and education crucial, which is why it's important that people know what this is and the message is out there. Protecting children from ongoing abuse is important, and the courts recognize this. They recognize this by ordering CAFCAS reports, fact-find hearings to assess risks, appoint guardians or child psychologists to evaluate contact restrictions and supervise visits when necessary, encourage therapeutic interventions with the affected children. By recognizing the patterns and equipping the victims with knowledge, the legal system can protect both survivors and their children. And it is important that the courts continue to do this. And I think this is very, very important.
I guess it's heartening to hear that the courts are making a stand on this, and recognizing it. What is the case law that kind of sits behind it? What are the precedents at the moment? And I guess beyond that, what else do you kind of see that might happen over the course of the next few years around the law here?
Yeah, so, the law's been evolving, and there have been key cases which have shaped how the courts approach domestic abuse, coercive control, and gaslighting. This was something which wasn't even considered years and years ago. And it's something which has now recently been considered in the recent years, and especially since the Domestic Abuse Act has been put forward. Now, the case of HN and others established a more structured approach to coercive control and psychological abuse, addressing key issues such as fact-finding hearings, the limitations of Scotch schedules, and the relevance of criminal law concepts in family cases. Another case was F&M, a landmark case recognizing coercive control was father's controlling behavior brutalized and dehumanized the mother, reinforcing the need for courts to look beyond the physical violence. Against a very difficult procedural background, a fact-finding hearing took place for Mr. Justice Hayden. And at the conclusion of the fact-finding hearing, Mr. Justice Hayden found that the nature of the allegation made by the mother constituted a pattern of coercive and controlled behavior by the father. He concluded that the mother had been subjected to a brutalizing, dehumanizing regime and was profoundly coercive of her autonomy. It was also noted that although there was no legal definition of coercive and controlled behavior within the family courts, he thought the term was unambiguous and needs no embellishment, understanding the scope and the ambit of the behavior. However, it requires recognition that coercion will usually involve a pattern of acts encompassing, for example, assault, intimidation. Mr. Justice Hayden noted that it's often difficult for professionals to identify coercive and controlled behavior and effectively need to investigate that. And that was something that was put forward in this case. And I think since this case, there's been a lot more awareness. The next case would be Re B. Now, this was a case that involved the cross-allegation of domestic abuse from the father and the mother. The court recognized that gaslighting was a form of insidious abuse that causes victims to question their own reality. Now, this was the first case to explicitly reference gaslighting, and while gaslighting lacks standalone legal precedent, these rulings guide how courts can assess psychological manipulation and coercive behaviors. And these are key references of cases that I use when I argue domestic abuse cases in court.
I don't think we are going to do gaslighting, narcissistic behavior, domestic abuse justice in a half an hour podcast, but if through listening to this, practitioners are more cognizant of what those two behaviors are and how they impact victims, and understand a little more about the current legal framework around them, then perhaps we've done a little bit of our job today, Shoba.
Yes, if there's one message I want to leave people with today, it's that gaslighting and narcissistic abuse is not just a personal struggle. They're deeply psychological, invisible wounds that can strip a person of their confidence and even their sense of reality. But the fact is that the victims are questioning, seeking answers, listening to conversations like this. And this is the first step for them reclaiming their truth and wanting to go ahead, because no one deserves to live in a state of self-doubt. And there are people, professionals out there who understand and believe you. This is to the victims. There are people out there who believe you and are there to help you. The first step is to contact them, and the professionals need to have more education. I think that they're not alone, and it's important that there is a recovery which is available for them. There is help out there. And I think that's what the legal professionals need to support them the best way possible. And I think that's the message I would like to put forward.
Well, a message that I wholeheartedly endorse. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, Shoba.
Thank you for having me.
The Today's Family Lawyer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Shoba. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.